Language is not just a tool for speaking. It is the way we think, the way we feel, and the way we define our reality. Most of us were born into a language that feels like home, like comfort, like identity. But growth begins the moment we challenge comfort. Thinking in English is not about replacing who you are. It is about expanding who you can become. It is about giving your thoughts a wider sky to fly in, without boundaries, without hesitation, without fear of being misunderstood. Thinking in English builds mental clarity in a way that slowly restructures the entire inner world of a person. When someone grows up using their native language, their thoughts naturally form in that language, carrying all the emotional weight, cultural expressions, and familiar patterns of thinking. This feels safe and automatic, but it also creates a hidden layer of processing when learning a second language like English. Every idea first appears in the native language, then gets translated mentally, and finally is spoken or written in English. This constant translation creates a delay in thinking, and that delay often becomes the reason behind hesitation, confusion, and lack of confidence. The mind is powerful, but when it is forced to operate in two languages at the same time, its energy gets divided and clarity becomes harder to maintain. When a person begins to think directly in English, something inside the mind starts to simplify. The brain no longer needs to perform the extra step of translation. Thoughts begin to take shape in a more direct form, almost like switching from a crowded road to an open highway. This shift allows ideas to flow without interruption. The mind starts choosing simpler structures, shorter expressions, and more direct meanings because it is no longer influenced by the complexity of translation. In this process, thinking becomes lighter, and mental noise slowly begins to reduce. The person does not just learn a language, they begin to reshape how thoughts are formed in real time. Clarity begins to grow because the mind starts focusing on meaning rather than words. When translation is removed, attention naturally moves toward understanding the core idea instead of searching for equivalent words in another language. This creates a stronger connection between thought and expression. The person begins to notice that ideas are not as complicated as they once felt. Even complex thoughts become easier to break down because the mind is no longer trapped in linguistic switching. This is where mental clarity starts to feel natural, not forced. Thoughts become more structured, and the inner dialogue becomes more organized, as if the mind is learning to speak to itself in a cleaner voice. As this habit develops, self-awareness also starts to change. The way a person talks to themselves internally becomes more direct, more confident, and less cluttered. Instead of overthinking how to express something, the mind begins to focus on what is being expressed. This shift reduces internal hesitation. Many people experience self-doubt not because they lack knowledge, but because their thoughts get tangled during expression. When thinking happens directly in English, that tangle slowly loosens. The mind begins to trust its own flow. Even mistakes start to feel less intimidating because thinking and expressing are no longer two separate processes, but one continuous movement. This mental clarity also impacts decision-making. When thoughts are clear, decisions become quicker and more confident. The mind does not spend extra time translating emotions or analyzing multiple language layers. Instead, it responds directly to situations. This creates a sense of mental freedom where ideas are not blocked by hesitation. Over time, this freedom becomes a habit, and the person starts to feel more in control of their thoughts rather than overwhelmed by them. Even silence becomes meaningful because The mind is not constantly busy converting language. It is simply observing, processing, and responding in a more natural flow. In this state, learning English itself becomes easier because the mind is no longer treating it as a subject to memorize, but as a medium to think through. Words begin to attach themselves directly to meaning rather than translation. Sentences form more naturally, and understanding becomes faster. The person begins to notice patterns in language instead of memorizing rules mechanically. This creates a deeper connection with communication, where expression feels less like effort and more like movement of thought. And gradually, the inner voice starts shaping itself in English without forcing, without pressure, without even realizing when the shift fully begins. Just flowing through ideas as they appear, connecting one thought to another in a continuous stream where clarity keeps growing in layers that feel endless. Strengthening confidence in communication is not about learning more words or memorizing more grammar rules. It is about removing the fear that sits silently behind every sentence before it is spoken. Many people already know English at a basic or even intermediate level, yet when they try to speak, their voice becomes uncertain. Their thoughts scatter, and their mind starts questioning every word before it leaves their mouth. This hesitation is not a language problem. It is a confidence problem created by overthinking and constant self-judgment. The moment a person begins to think directly in English, instead of translating from their native language, a powerful shift begins to take place in how they express themselves. Because the mind stops treating English as something foreign and starts treating it as a natural extension of thought. When thinking happens in a native language first, the speaker unconsciously builds pressure inside their mind. They imagine how the sentence should be structured in their mother tongue. Then they search for English equivalents. And during this process, they begin to doubt themselves. Am I saying it correctly? Is the grammar right? Will people judge my accent? What if I make a mistake? These thoughts appear all at once, and they create a barrier between thought and speech. That barrier weakens confidence before a word is even spoken. But when a person starts forming thoughts directly in English, that barrier begins to dissolve. The mind stops switching between languages and starts focusing only on expression, not translation, not perfection. Only communication. Confidence in communication grows when the mind feels free from constant correction. Speaking is not a test where every sentence must be perfect. It is a flow of ideas that should move naturally from the mind to the voice. When thinking in English becomes a habit, the inner critic slowly becomes quieter. Instead of analyzing every word, the mind starts allowing words to come out as they are formed. This creates a sense of ease, where expression feels less like pressure and more like movement. Even if mistakes happen, they no longer feel like failures, because the focus shifts from correctness to clarity. And clarity is always more powerful than perfection in real communication. As this shift continues, a person starts noticing that their fear of speaking decreases. They become more willing to participate in conversations, even if their sentences are not fully polished. This willingness is the foundation of confidence. Confidence is not built by waiting until everything is perfect. It is built by speaking even when things are imperfect. Thinking in English supports this process because it reduces the gap between thought and speech. When thoughts are already in English, the mind does not need extra time to convert ideas, which means responses become faster, smoother, and more natural. This speed creates a feeling of control, and control naturally builds confidence. Another important transformation happens in self-perception. When a person consistently thinks in English, they begin to see themselves as someone capable of communicating beyond their comfort zone. At first, this feels unnatural, even uncomfortable, but slowly that discomfort turns into familiarity. The mind begins to associate English not with fear, but with expression. And when the mind changes its association, behavior follows. The person starts speaking more freely, asking questions without hesitation, sharing opinions without fear, and engaging in conversations without constantly worrying about mistakes. This is where true communication confidence begins to form. The most powerful part of this transformation is that it does not require external validation. No one needs to approve your English for you to feel confident in it. The confidence comes from within, from the ability to think and express without interruption. Every small moment of self-talk in English, every simple sentence formed in the mind, every attempt to describe daily life in English builds this inner strength. Over time, speaking becomes less about language skill and more about mental freedom, where thoughts are no longer trapped behind fear, but are allowed to move openly into words without resistance, flowing naturally from intention to expression, growing stronger with every attempt. Becoming part of identity rather than effort, connecting to a global world through English is not just about learning a language. It is about expanding the boundaries of thought, identity, and opportunity. In today's world, communication is no longer limited by geography, and the ability to understand and express ideas in English opens doors that once seemed unreachable. When a person begins to think in English, they are not simply learning words, they are entering a shared global space where ideas, cultures, knowledge, and opportunities continuously interact. This shift changes the way a person sees themselves and the world around them, because language is not only a medium of communication, it is also a bridge between minds across different countries and experiences. Most people naturally grow up thinking in their native language, which deeply connects them to their culture, emotions, and surroundings. This connection is powerful and meaningful, but it can also limit exposure to wider perspectives when communication stays within one linguistic boundary. English, on the other hand, functions as a global link that connects people from different parts of the world. When thinking begins to form in English, the mind slowly starts stepping outside local limitations and enters a broader space where ideas are shared internationally. This does not mean leaving behind one's identity, but rather adding another layer to it, a layer that allows interaction with the world without translation barriers or hesitation. As thinking in English becomes more natural, understanding global conversations becomes easier. Books, articles, educational content, discussions, and digital platforms that were once difficult to access become more meaningful and understandable. Instead of depending on translation or interpretation, the mind begins to absorb information directly. This direct access increases learning speed and reduces the gap between curiosity and understanding. A person is no longer delayed by language barriers when exploring new ideas, which allows them to stay more connected to global trends, knowledge systems, and innovations happening around the world. This connection also changes the way a person communicates with others internationally. When thinking is already aligned with English, interaction becomes smoother and more confident. There is less fear of misunderstanding and more focus on sharing ideas clearly. Communication becomes less about struggling for words and more about exchanging thoughts. In a global environment, whether online or offline, This ability becomes extremely valuable because it allows individuals to participate in discussions without feeling excluded or limited. It creates a sense of belonging in spaces where different cultures and backgrounds come together. Thinking in English also expands imagination. When a person is exposed to global ideas, their thinking naturally becomes more open. They begin to see different ways of solving problems, different lifestyles, different opinions, and different creative expressions. This exposure slowly shapes a more flexible mindset. Instead of viewing the world from a single cultural perspective, the mind starts to understand that there are multiple ways of thinking and living. This awareness encourages growth and adaptability, two qualities that are essential in a rapidly changing world where information and communication move across borders instantly. Another important aspect of global connection through English is opportunity. Many educational, professional, and creative platforms today operate primarily in English. When a person can think in English, they are not only able to understand these opportunities, but also to actively participate in them. Whether it is studying abroad, applying for international jobs, collaborating with global communities, or sharing creative work with a wider audience, English becomes the medium that makes all of this possible. It removes the barrier of translation and hesitation, allowing ideas to travel freely from one mind to another across the world over time. This ability creates a deeper transformation in identity. A person no longer sees themselves as limited to one region or one system of thinking. Instead, they begin to feel connected to a larger human experience where ideas are shared beyond borders. This does not erase cultural identity, but enhances it by adding global awareness. The mind becomes more open, more curious, and more willing to engage with different perspectives. Thinking in English becomes not just a skill, but a gateway to a wider intellectual and social world where communication flows continuously and understanding expands without boundaries, creating a sense of participation in something much larger than individual experience. Transforming self-identity through language is a process that happens quietly, almost invisibly, yet it changes the way a person sees themselves, their abilities, and their future. Identity is not something fixed or permanent. It is shaped by thoughts, experiences, environment, and the way we express those experiences. When a person begins to think in English, something subtle but powerful starts to shift inside their inner world. They are no longer just translating ideas from one language to another. They are slowly building a new way of thinking, a new structure of expression, and in that structure, a new version of themselves begins to emerge. At the beginning, thinking in English feels unfamiliar and even uncomfortable. The mind naturally resists change because it prefers patterns it already knows. Native language feels safe because it is tied to childhood, emotions, memories, and identity. It carries emotional depth that feels personal and natural. But when English is introduced as a thinking language, the mind enters a phase of adjustment. During this phase, a person may feel uncertain, slow, or even disconnected from their thoughts because they are learning to form ideas in a completely different structure. This discomfort is not a sign of weakness, but a sign of transformation taking place within the mind. As this process continues, the mind slowly begins to adapt. Thoughts that once needed translation start forming directly in English. At first, these thoughts are simple and limited, but over time, they become more natural and fluid. This shift changes how a person perceives themselves internally. Instead of seeing themselves as someone struggling with a second language, They begin to see themselves as someone capable of thinking differently. This small change in perception becomes the foundation of a new identity, where learning and growth are no longer external goals, but internal experiences. Self-identity is deeply connected to the language we use in our minds. When a person constantly thinks in their native language, their self-expression is shaped by that language's limitations and strengths. But when English becomes part of internal thinking, it introduces new ways of expression, new vocabulary, and new structures of thought. This does not replace the original identity, but expands it. The person begins to feel that they are not confined to one version of themselves. They can exist in multiple expressions, multiple ways of thinking, and multiple forms of communication depending on the situation. This realization creates a sense of flexibility within identity with time. Confidence begins to grow not only in communication, but also in self-perception. A person starts believing that they can adapt, learn, and evolve. This belief is not forced. It develops naturally through experience. Every moment of thinking in English, every attempt to form a sentence internally, every small success in understanding or expressing ideas contributes to this growing confidence. The mind starts associating English not with difficulty, but with progress. And when the mind associates something with progress, it becomes part of identity rather than an external challenge. This transformation also affects how a person interacts with the world. They begin to feel more open to new experiences, more willing to step outside familiar boundaries, and more comfortable in unfamiliar environments. English thinking creates a sense of adaptability, where change is no longer feared, but accepted as part of growth. This adaptability becomes a core part of identity, shaping how a person responds to challenges, opportunities, and communication with others. The mind no longer feels restricted by language barriers. It begins to feel expanded by them. Over time, the distinction between native identity and learned identity begins to blur. Instead of feeling divided between two languages, the person starts to feel integrated. Both languages exist within them. But English becomes a tool for global expression, while their native language remains the emotional foundation. This balance creates a more complete sense of self, where identity is not limited to one form of communication, but enriched by multiple forms. The person begins to understand that identity is not something to protect from change, but something that grows through change. In this continuous evolution, thinking in English becomes more than a skill. It becomes a mirror reflecting a changing self. The way thoughts are formed, the way ideas are structured, and the way expression flows all contribute to shaping a new inner voice. This voice is not separate from the original self, but an expanded version of it, shaped by learning, experience, and adaptation, constantly evolving through each thought that forms, each idea that develops, and each moment where expression finds its own natural path without resistance.